You're looking at it right now and you're probably on it. And you're definitely relying on it.
Anyone? Anyone?
Two words? Google Maps, and we can talk more about Google Maps. We're doing some fantastic stuff in Australia on Google Maps. But no, it's actually what you're accessing Google Maps with. It's actually Wi-Fi.
You know, I didn't know that. And you said there's something else. You know, when we saw a great, by the way, Facebook planned it well, a plug for Australia with
absolutely. Just as I came in, the Qantas ads came up, and I also now will have to think about the Northern Territory.
And also, you were saying to me before that another invention that planes rely on all the time is another Australian.
And that's exactly right. I mean, anybody who flew here today will know you pretty much hope that if anything happens, they find the black box. Again, Australia actually invented the black box. So when it comes to innovation and inventions, Australia has a very, very proud history. You know, as we said, the Wi-Fi, the black box, the plastic banknote. Do you remember putting the old-fashioned banknote through the wash?
Yes. Happens just by mistake on the
Exactly.
time. Senator, we were saying before, obviously you're from Perth, and it's notorious, well, known as a mining and a centre. How are you seeing that Australia, which is so rich in natural resources and growing that way, and now you're focusing on innovation? How's that shift happening?
And it's very much in terms of Australia has been a country that's innovated for so long now. We actually lead the world when it comes to automated mining, you know, for so many reasons, and in particular from the Western Australian perspective, our economy is a resources-based economy. So in terms of having to innovate, we've actually done that. But also what Australia offers that so many other countries in the world don't offer is space. And I think one of the exciting inventions that we've been talking about is the square kilometre array in Australia.
So, and can you tell us a little bit more about that, when it's going to be coming into effect?
So the square kilometre array is exactly that. When it's up and running in 2020, it will literally be the largest telescope in the world. It's been jointly hosted by South Africa and Australia. And when it is up and running in 2020, just imagine this. The square kilometre array will produce every second the amount of data the World Wide Web currently produces in 24 hours. So when you have a conversation about data, in 2 years' time, that is the capacity that the square kilometre array will actually have.
That's pretty...
mind-blowing?
Yeah.
It's exciting as well though, isn't it? But it really does mean that artificial intelligence and the role of artificial intelligence in actually analysing that much data, there are so many opportunities.
Well, this is actually quite an exciting opportunity to think about it for Australia. We were speaking before, obviously there's traditionally, you were telling me, you know, there's been focus on employment and there's focus on innovation. How are you seeing the roles combined? Because ultimately, building an innovation ecosystem, we'll talk about it more, we need to have more jobs and more opportunities.
Absolutely, and the attitude we take in Australia, and it's very much also the attitude that Singapore takes, is innovation is absolutely fantastic. Innovation is required, and in particular in terms of, you know, transitioning economies. But the question you ultimately need to ask yourself is, how does innovation ultimately equal job creation? Because what does the average person in the street want out of their government? And it is very much a job. And so we very much look at innovation in Australia as harbouring the next, you know, the future of work, the jobs that are going to be created for all Australians.
And is this something that you're starting to look at, you know, right the way down? Because you see here in Singapore and around, we've got universities, corporates, entrepreneurs. Are you seeing that this focus for what your policies are starting from the bottom and working up?
Oh, look, absolutely, and collaboration is actually the key to success in innovation. You know, government itself always needs to be an enabler. I'm a big believer in that. Government must lead by example, but government itself doesn't create jobs. Well, not in Australia. That's very much the role of industry, the private sector. So we need to ensure we're putting in place the right policy framework that industry can then utilise to prosper and grow, to innovate and create jobs. And a key part of that is ensuring that we incentivise collaboration between government, between, you know, the public-private partnerships, but also between our research institutions.
And looking at, I see that you've been doing around the world, you've created also these like launch pads, haven't you, for helping Aussies, almost like kangaroo
It
around,
is
going
literally
around.
hopping out of Australia and launching themselves into one of 5 landing pads that we have created around the world. And I'm delighted to say that Singapore was chosen by the Australian government as being the perfect place for Australian startups, and they have to pass a pretty stringent test to actually be part of this program. It just doesn't happen by accident. As you know, a lot of hard work needs to go into your idea. You need to come with a very, very good business case. We've now had 4 cohorts come to Singapore and utilise the landing pad. And in fact, in the first cohort, one of our startups that does medical imagery via the cloud, within the first week of being here, the landing pad was able to give them the contacts they needed, and they got a major contract with Singapore's biggest private provider of medical imagery. And we're now up to cohort 5.
Wow, that's pretty impressive growth. And it seemed, because it's quite interesting, we were saying before that Australia is part of Asia, but how do you see Australia's positioning in certainly this region?
Oh, look, absolutely. I mean, we have an incredibly close relationship with Asia. Earlier this year in March, Australia actually hosted ASEAN Australia. You know, I'm from Perth, and I often joke with people, I love coming up to Singapore because I'm on the same time zone, and it's actually closer for me to get to Singapore than it is for me to go to Canberra, Sydney or Melbourne. So Western Australians, I think, really have a great appreciation of that very personal relationship that we do have with Asia. But also Singapore is a great launch pad or landing pad, you know, whatever the term you want to use, to actually get into that broader ASEAN region. So for Australian startups to be able to come to Singapore, to be able to work with and make great contacts in Singapore that can then ultimately also launch them into the greater ASEAN region. I mean, talk about opportunity.
Yeah, I know, it's fascinating, because the other thing as well is we forget Australia is a continent. You know, you are a huge...
We're a very large country.
Exactly. And how does that, because ultimately there's like different clusters you were saying of where's like the main innovation hub, and is that where you're looking if companies wishing to come into Australia to settle up? Have you got like areas that you see as like...
It's a really interesting question, because in Australia each state has a very, very proud reputation of fostering startups. But in terms of probably where the majority of startups are, yes, it is on the East Coast, I will admit that. Probably Sydney and Melbourne, but more so because of population. It's population driven, and Sydney's the obvious place for so many people to go. But we have, you know, some fantastic startups in Australia, and as I said, giving them the opportunity to launch themselves out of Australia and into those 5 landing pads, and one of them being in Singapore, I mean, really is a dream come true for many companies.
I'm sure, exactly. I think all of us are waiting for that opportunity to
launch into Australia. I'll give a plug for
Australia.
Australia as well. Come down and launch
Exactly.
yourself into
We've got to
Australia.
make a Singapore landing pad there, exactly. You know, there's many areas we were talking about. You've got all the sports and great beaches that I'm sure we could create a co-working space on one of those.
An outdoor co-working space.
Definitely. Going back to your home state with mining, are you seeing that many companies are really, like, in the resources sector, like growing the tech in that sector and utilising?
Absolutely. Look, it was a cost reality for so many companies that in order to, you know, continue with operations, they had no choice but to automate. And as I said, I mean, remote mining in Australia, you have a lot of the mining operations that are now actually thousands of kilometres from head offices in Perth, but they are actually being run out of Perth. A lot of the trains are now automated. We lead the world when it comes to automated mining. What we're also currently doing via Woodside Energy in Perth is we currently in Perth, Western Australia, at Woodside, have one of the 2 NASA robonauts. Okay, so the humanoids. So one of them had just returned from a mission in space, and the other one is sitting on St George's Terrace in Perth, and Woodside are looking at basically how they can utilise that NASA technology to get into places where humans cannot go. So those incredibly dangerous roles on mine sites, which occupational safety and health says under no circumstances can a human do it, how can you actually send the robot in to undertake the role and obviously then enhance the mining operation? So that's where, you know, artificial intelligence, robotics, etc., technology is really adding value to industries in Australia.
I mean, we've been speaking about this for a few days of how AI and tech can enhance industry rather than that. You mentioned something before, we were talking about in infrastructure. What's like your government's plan for investing more in infrastructure and those areas?
It's a brilliant question, and in particular given this audience. Often as a government, when you talk about infrastructure, people say, oh, did you mean a road? Absolutely, as a government, you need to invest in that hard infrastructure that people can see. But there's another type of infrastructure, and that's the enabling infrastructure for science, technology, engineering and math. And we've just brought down our latest budget, and we've made a massive investment now over 12 years in that enabling infrastructure for science, technology, engineering and math. And it's very much to give both domestically and internationally businesses and research institutions which we want to come to Australia the security that the Australian government understands what you need. In my home state of Western Australia, we have supercomputers. They're obviously able to analyse, for example, a year's worth of data for a researcher in a matter of minutes, okay? We've just invested in an additional 2 supercomputers because we understand the benefits of artificial intelligence in what it gives to the analysing of complex problems, and you get the outcome in a very, very quick way.
So it's quite interesting that you're seeing that. So as a government, you're now doing further investment in those areas. And what would you say, if I say to you, the next few years, what would you like to see happening in Australia in the whole tech scene? What's like your plan?
Oh, look, very much so. And it's looking at what we do best in Australia and how you capitalise on that. So you know that obviously the global space economy is worth US $345 billion. Australia actually has some unique capabilities it can bring to the global space economy. We currently have only a 0.8% share of that, but we actually did not have an Australian space agency. So we launched a few weeks ago the first Australian space agency. We are now quite literally open for business, both domestically, but more so those international opportunities. Between now and 2030, it is estimated that we can create up to 20,000 new, highly skilled, highly paid jobs. So that is for us the creation of a new industry by government. Government becomes the enabler, whereby both domestic companies and international companies can now say, we want to work with Australia in relation to the creation of a new industry. So I think when it comes to, say, the latest and the newest industry in Australia, it's very much now saying we want to increase our capacity when it comes to utilising that global space economy.
So pretty much you've got everything from mining to space, beaches.
And ultimately it's all interrelated. In the beaches, we need to make sure we keep our beaches
so
as beautiful as they are.
Are you a rugby or a cricket fan?
I'm from WA. I'm actually AFL Australian football.
Oh,
so
right.
I'm a West Coast Eagles
that
fan
the
for
Aussie,
anybody else. That's the Aussie rules football.
Does anyone here actually know or understand
what Aussie rules football
rules?
is?
Anyone? Oh, we've got one over
yes.
there.
Eagles or Dockers?
I have no idea.
Someone
the rules.
here.
Senator, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure hearing that how you're, as a government, that you're driving forward, that you see innovation and you see jobs as coming together as one. And your final thought to the audience on kind of how you can see Singapore, innovation and government coming together.
Singapore is globally renowned when it comes to innovation as being a world leader. Australia has an incredibly strong relationship with Singapore going back now many, many, many years. We already collaborate in so many areas. In fact, Australia is opening our CSIRO office in Singapore later this year. In terms of the relationship with Western Australia, we actually partner with Singapore in relation to those supercomputers. So for me, it's very much strengthening the fantastic relationship we already have, working out what we can do together to become world leaders in certain aspects, and just continuing to innovate.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a round of applause to Senator.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much.